She stood at the end of my driveway with her arms crossed, watching a line of 40 people stretch down the public sidewalk in front of my house, waiting for free plates of jerk chicken and fried plantains, and she said, loud enough for at least a dozen of them to hear, "You think this is clever, but you're going to regret this." I want you to remember that sentence, because by the end of this story, it was the single most incorrect prediction anyone made in the entire 11 weeks this played out, and I have never once regretted a single minute of it. My name is Marcus Delacroix Boone, though everybody in my neighborhood just calls me Chef Marcus, which is a nickname I earned the honest way, cooking on weekends out of a converted step van I bought used 6 years ago and slowly built into a legitimate business called Isle Kitchen, named after my grandmother's home island, serving Caribbean food at farmers' markets, festivals, and for the past 3 years, out of my own driveway on Sunday afternoons, where I'd built up a loyal following of regulars who came as much for the food as for the folding table of dominoes I kept set up under my carport for anyone who wanted to sit and stay a while. I live in Cobblestone Ridge, a community of about 360 homes with a fairly relaxed HOA by most standards, or at least it had been relaxed for the 11 years I'd lived there, right up until a woman named Patricia Wexler was elected board president about a year before this story starts. Patricia ran on the usual platform: property values, community standards, the same language you hear in basically every HOA election in the country. But it became clear fairly quickly after she took office that Patricia had a very specific idea of what a proper residential neighborhood was supposed to look like, and a food truck parked in a driveway on Sundays, however beloved by the actual residents, did not fit that idea. I want to be clear about something before I go further, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how unreasonable this situation became. I was not running an unlicensed operation out of a residential yard, causing traffic problems or noise complaints. I held a full county food service permit, a state mobile vending license, proper liability insurance, and I had, for 3 years, kept my Sunday service small and controlled, generally 40 to 60 customers over a 4-hour window, mostly neighbors and their friends, parked entirely within my own driveway, never blocking the street, never running past 4 in the afternoon, always cleaning up completely before evening. Several of my closest friends in the neighborhood were people I'd met specifically because they wandered over that first year out of curiosity about the smell of jerk seasoning drifting down the block and never really left. Patricia's first move, about 4 months into her term, was a newsletter announcement stating that the board had identified an unauthorized home-based commercial operation in the community and would be reviewing the governing documents to determine appropriate next steps. She didn't name me directly, but everybody on my street knew exactly who she meant, since I was, as far as I knew, the only home-based food business anyone in Cobblestone Ridge was running. I did what I thought was the reasonable thing. I requested a meeting with the board, brought copies of all my permits and licenses, explained that I'd been operating this way for 3 years without a single complaint filed against me in that entire time, and offered, in a genuine spirit of compromise, to reduce my hours further or add additional insurance coverage if the board had specific concerns about liability. Patricia's response, delivered a week later in a formal letter, was that the governing document's restriction on commercial or business activity conducted from a residential lot was unambiguous, that my permits from the county and state were irrelevant to the association's own separate authority to regulate land use within the community, and that I had 30 days to permanently cease operating Isle Kitchen from my property or face escalating fines beginning at $200 per violation. I want to tell you about the research I did over the following 2 weeks, because it turned out to matter enormously later, and because I think it's useful for anyone else who ever finds themselves fighting a restriction that feels unreasonable, but that the governing documents seem to technically support. I pulled our full Declaration of Covenants, the actual founding legal document for Cobblestone Ridge, filed with the county over 25 years earlier when the community was first developed, and I read every single word of the commercial activity restriction Patricia had cited. What I found surprised me. The actual language of the restriction written decades before food trucks were even a common concept, prohibited the conduct of any trade, business, or commercial enterprise requiring regular customer traffic, signage, or the storage of commercial inventory upon a residential lot. It was clearly written, based on the surrounding clauses about home occupations and storage sheds, to address things like auto repair shops or retail operations run out of a garage, situations involving permanent fixtures, ongoing customer traffic throughout the week, and visible commercial signage cluttering a residential street. My truck, notably, was not stored on my property at all. I parked it at a commercial storage lot 6 miles away every day of the week except Sunday, when I drove it to my driveway for a single 4-hour window, then drove it away again that same evening. There was no permanent commercial fixture on my lot. There was no signage beyond a small magnetic decal on the truck itself. And critically, when I checked our declarations amendment history at the county recorder's office, I found that this particular clause had never been formally updated or reinterpreted by any prior board to address mobile food vending specifically, meaning Patricia's application of it to my situation was, at minimum, a novel and aggressive interpretation rather than a clear, unambiguous restriction, as she'd claimed in her letter. I brought this research back to the board in writing, laying out the actual language of the covenant and explaining precisely why I believed my temporary, mobile, permitted operation didn't fall under restriction written to address permanent commercial enterprises. Patricia's response this time came not from her, but from the HOA's attorney, a curt 2-paragraph letter reiterating the board's position and noting that the 30-day compliance window remained in effect regardless of my interpretation of the covenant language. This is the point in the story where I want to introduce you to the person who changed the entire trajectory of this fight, a woman named Odalise Kim, who lived 4 houses down and had been one of my most loyal Sunday regulars for almost 2 years by that point, showing up nearly every week with her 2 teenage sons for plates of curry goat and rice. Odalise, it turned out, was a municipal land use attorney by profession, specializing specifically in the intersection between local zoning ordinances and private homeowners association restrictions, a specialty so precisely relevant to my situation that when she found out what was happening and showed up at my door with a legal pad under her arm, I genuinely felt like the universe was making up for the previous month of frustration all at once. I've been wanting an excuse to get involved in this fight since Patricia's first newsletter, she told me, sitting at my kitchen table. You have a much stronger position than you probably realize, and I don't think Patricia or her attorney have thought this through nearly as carefully as they think they have. Odalise explained something to me that night that became the foundation of everything that followed. She pointed out that our county, like many jurisdictions across the state, had passed a specific mobile food vending ordinance just 2 years earlier, in direct response to the broader growth of the food truck industry, an ordinance that included language explicitly protecting a permitted mobile vendor's right to operate temporarily from a private residential property with the owner's consent, so long as certain conditions around hours, noise, and public right-of-way access were met. Conditions I was already meeting comfortably. HOAs love to act like their covenants exist in a bubble completely separate from actual municipal and state law, Odalise said, but that's not how the legal hierarchy actually works. A private governing document can add reasonable restrictions on top of what the law already requires, but it generally can't create a blanket prohibition that directly conflicts with a right the county has specifically and recently protected by ordinance, especially when, as you've shown, the original covenant language wasn't even written with mobile vending in mind in the first place. I asked her what that meant practically. It means, she said, that if Patricia tries to fine you or force you off your own driveway, we have a genuinely strong argument that the HOA's application of this covenant conflicts with the county's mobile vending ordinance, and county law, in a conflict like this, generally wins. But I also think, honestly, that there's a more interesting path here than just fighting this quietly through legal letters back and forth. I think you should let this play out publicly, because I have a feeling Patricia is about to make a mistake that's going to cost her a lot more than this dispute over your driveway ever will. I didn't fully understand what she meant by that until about 3 weeks later. On the Sunday, I decided to test exactly how far Patricia was willing to go. The 30-day compliance window Patricia had given me expired on a Sunday, and I made the decision, after long conversations with Odalys and with my wife Simone, who had been running the front counter and cash register for Isle Kitchen since the very beginning and who was, if anything, even more furious about this entire situation than I was, to continue operating that day exactly as I always had. I parked the truck in my driveway. I set up the folding tables. I opened for business at noon. Patricia showed up at 12:20, standing at the end of my driveway with a clipboard, watching my regular Sunday crowd start to gather. And it was in that moment, watching her scan the growing line of neighbors waiting for plates of food, that I saw something shift in her expression, something that looked less like principled enforcement of community standards and more like genuine, personal irritation at watching something she disapproved of succeed in plain view of the entire street. She left without saying anything to me directly that first Sunday, and I assumed, naively, that maybe this meant she was reconsidering. I was wrong. The violation notice and the first $200 fine arrived 4 days later, and this time, instead of simply notifying me privately, Patricia had also sent a mass email to the entire community, citing ongoing enforcement action against an unauthorized commercial operation, and reminding all residents to report any similar unpermitted business activity they observed in the neighborhood. That email is the specific moment this entire situation stopped being a private dispute between me and my HOA and became something the whole neighborhood was suddenly paying very close attention to. And it is also, I would learn much later, the exact moment Patricia made the mistake Odalys had been quietly predicting for weeks. Because Patricia's email didn't just alert my neighbors to a dispute. It alerted dozens of families, many of whom had never even tried Isle Kitchen before, that there was apparently some kind of controversy surrounding the guy with the food truck 4 streets over. And curiosity, it turns out, is a remarkably powerful marketing tool, one that Patricia had just deployed entirely against her own interests, without meaning to. By the following Sunday, my driveway crowd had nearly doubled. That's where things really started to escalate, and that's also where I made the decision that gives this story its title. The decision to take my truck out of my driveway entirely and park it, completely legally, along the public curb on the street in front of my house, on a stretch of road that belonged not to the HOA but to the county, where Patricia Wexler's authority, however aggressively she liked to wield it inside the boundaries of our community, ended completely. What happened over the following 6 Sundays, as word spread not just through Cobblestone Ridge, but through 3 neighboring communities, as the crowd grew from 40 people to over 200, as I made the decision, with Simone's full support, to start giving food away entirely for free rather than charging a dime, funded in a way none of us saw coming, is the reason this story eventually made the local evening news. The reason Patricia Wexler found herself facing not just an HOA dispute, but a level of public scrutiny she had clearly never once imagined when she sent that mass email. And the reason I am typing this now, a year later, from a driveway where Isle Kitchen still operates every single Sunday, exactly as it always has. That's where part 2 picks up. The decision to give the food away for free wasn't actually mine, not at first. It came from Odalys, sitting at my kitchen table the Tuesday after Patricia's mass email went out, laying out a strategy that I initially thought was a little bit insane. If you're operating on the public street charging money, she said, Patricia's attorney is eventually going to find some angle. Maybe a county business license technicality, maybe a parking ordinance nobody's thought to check yet, to try to shut you down anyway. But if you're not selling anything, if this becomes a free community event you're personally hosting and funding, you've moved out of commercial vending regulation almost entirely and into something the county has very little authority to interfere with at all. You're just a guy with a truck, feeding your neighbors for free on a public street on your own dime. I asked her, reasonably I thought, how exactly I was supposed to keep affording that, given that Isle Kitchen's Sunday driveway service had never been a huge profit center to begin with, mostly covering ingredient costs and a little extra toward the truck's maintenance fund. This is where Simone stepped in with an idea that ended up mattering more than any legal strategy Odalys came up with. Simone had, over the 3 years I'd been running the driveway service, quietly built up a following on the neighborhood's social media pages, mostly people sharing photos of their Sunday plates, tagging friends, the normal small-scale word of mouth that keeps a little community food business going. She suggested we post, honestly and without exaggeration, exactly what was happening. The HOA dispute, the fines, Patricia's mass email, and the decision to move to the street and start giving food away for free specifically because we refused to let a woman with a clipboard decide whether our neighbors got to eat good food on a Sunday afternoon. That post went, by the modest standards of a neighborhood Facebook group, completely viral. It was shared into 3 neighboring community pages within 24 hours. A local food blogger who apparently lived 2 subdivisions over picked it up and wrote a short piece about it. And almost immediately, something happened that none of us had anticipated. People started offering to help fund it. Not customers paying for their own plates, since we'd made clear everything would be free, but neighbors, strangers from other communities, even a few local businesses who'd read the story, started reaching out asking how they could contribute to what quickly became known around town as Sunday Feed. Simone set up a simple donation system, transparent, with every dollar and every expense posted publicly each week. And within the first month, we had more support than we knew what to do with, enough that we were able to not just sustain the free Sunday service, but actually expand it, adding a second folding table, then a third, eventually partnering with a local bakery 2 towns over whose owner reached out personally after seeing the story, offering free bread and pastries every week just to be part of what was happening. By the 4th Sunday on the street, the crowd had grown to somewhere over 200 people, stretching down the sidewalk in a line that curved around the corner of my block. Families from Cobblestone Ridge standing alongside families from at least 3 other neighborhoods. Kids playing an impromptu game of tag on my neighbor's lawn while their parents waited for plates. The folding dominoes table now joined by a second table where an elderly man named Winston Ibarra, who I'd never even met before all this started, had started running an informal chess club every week with anyone willing to play him. Patricia showed up on that 4th Sunday, standing at the end of my driveway with her arms crossed, and that's the moment I described at the very beginning of this story, watching a line of 40, now really closer to 200, waiting for free food, telling me I was going to regret this. I remember not really knowing how to respond to her in the moment, so I just offered her a plate, genuinely, no sarcasm intended, because whatever our dispute was, I wasn't about to turn away a hungry person standing in front of my house. She refused, predictably, and left, but her presence that day did something I don't think she intended at all. Several of the local news outlets that had been quietly following the story through the food blogger's original piece and Simone's public posts picked up on the fact that the HOA president had personally shown up to confront a free community meal. And within a week, a reporter from the regional evening news called asking to do a short segment on what had, by that point, become known throughout the county simply as Sunday Feed. The segment aired on a Thursday evening, running just under 4 minutes, featuring interviews with several neighbors waiting in line, footage of the crowd stretching down the block, Winston's chess table, the Domino's crew under my carport, and a brief comment from me explaining the entire situation, the driveway ban, the fines, the mass email, and the decision to move to the street rather than simply stop. The reporter had reached out to Patricia for comment as well, and her response, read on air by the anchor, was a short statement about maintaining community standards and consistent enforcement of governing documents, language that, played immediately after 4 minutes of footage showing 200 people eating free jerk chicken on a public sidewalk with their kids, landed about as sympathetically with the viewing audience as you might imagine. Within days of that broadcast, the HOA management office started receiving what one of the office staff later told a friend of mine was an unprecedented volume of calls and emails. Not complaints about Sunday Feed, but complaints about Patricia, about the fines, about the mass email, about what a significant number of Cobblestone Ridge residents apparently felt was an embarrassing and mean-spirited use of board authority that had made the entire community look bad on regional television. I want to walk you through the actual legal resolution, because the public attention, while it mattered enormously for the pressure it put on Patricia personally, wasn't ultimately what resolved the underlying dispute. That resolution came from Odele's, who had throughout this entire period been quietly building a formal legal challenge to the fines Patricia had continued assessing against me even after I'd moved operations to the public street, arguing that these fines were not only legally unsupportable given the mobile vending ordinance conflict she'd identified weeks earlier, but that continuing to assess and attempt to collect them constituted, in her professional opinion, a form of harassment given the clear personal animosity Patricia had displayed throughout the dispute. Odele's filed a formal legal challenge with the county, requesting a determination on whether the HOA's covenant restriction, as applied to a permitted mobile food vendor operating temporarily and intermittently, conflicted with the county's mobile vending ordinance in a way that rendered the HOA's enforcement action void. The county's determination, issued about 6 weeks later, sided decisively with our position, finding explicitly that the recently passed mobile vending ordinance did protect exactly the kind of temporary, permitted, consent-based operation I had been running, and that the HOA's covenant, being both older than the ordinance and never formally amended to address mobile vending specifically, could not be used to override those protections. The determination didn't just void the fines Patricia had assessed. It effectively meant that my original driveway service, the one Patricia had banned in the first place, had been legally protected the entire time, which meant every fine, every enforcement letter, every bit of the original 30-day compliance demand had been, from a legal standpoint, invalid from the very beginning. That determination, combined with the mounting community pressure following the news segment, led to a special board meeting about 3 weeks later, called at the request of a homeowner petition that gathered signatures faster than I think even Odele's expected, given how many neighbors had by that point either eaten a free plate at Sunday Feed themselves or simply grown tired of watching their community's reputation take a hit over what most people, once they understood the full picture, considered an obviously unreasonable use of board power. At that meeting, held in a clubhouse packed as full as I'd ever seen it, Patricia attempted to defend her actions along largely the same lines as her earlier public statement: consistent enforcement, community standards, the language of someone who had clearly decided, even facing an adverse county determination and a viral news segment, not to budge an inch. It was, in the end, not any single dramatic confrontation that ended her presidency, but something quieter and, I think, more damning: a straightforward vote of no confidence brought by the membership, passed by an overwhelming majority, removing her from the board effective immediately with a new interim president, a soft-spoken but clearly well-respected longtime resident named Harold Beaumont, taking over, and within his first week, formally amending the covenant's commercial activity clause to explicitly and permanently protect exactly the kind of temporary, permitted, consent-based home food service that Isle Kitchen had always been. Patricia moved out of Cobblestone Ridge about 5 months later. I don't know exactly where she landed, and I'll admit, unlike some of the other situations I've heard about from friends in similar disputes over the years, I don't feel much satisfaction thinking about what happened to her specifically. What I feel instead, when I think back on all of this, is something closer to gratitude, strange as that might sound, because the entire ordeal, as frustrating and expensive and exhausting as it was, is the reason Sunday Feed exists at all. And Sunday Feed, a year later, is still running every single week, funded now by a small but stable base of regular community donors, feeding somewhere between 150 and 200 people every Sunday, entirely for free. On the same public street where Patricia once told me I was going to regret parking my truck. I moved my regular business back into my driveway once the covenant amendment passed, charging normally the rest of the week for catering orders and market appearances. But Sunday Feed stays exactly where it started, out on the street, because Simone and I decided, somewhere around the 8th week of this whole ordeal, that we didn't actually want to move it back, even after we legally could. There was something about that open public space, the way it let anyone from any neighborhood walk up and sit down at Winston's chess table or grab a plate without needing to feel like they were crossing into someone else's private property, that felt like it had become the actual point of the whole thing, more than the food itself, more than proving Patricia wrong, more than any of it. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Odalise said to me near the very end of the whole ordeal, sitting on my porch on an ordinary Sunday evening after the crowds had gone home and we were cleaning up the last of the folding tables. She said that HOA boards count on most homeowners not knowing the actual boundaries of their own authority, assuming that whatever's written in a decades-old covenant is the final word, when in reality, the law around them, county ordinances, state regulations, the basic right to use public space, has usually moved forward in ways most board members never bother to check. Patricia assumed her clipboard and her 30-day compliance letter were the end of the conversation. She never once imagined that the conversation would end, instead, with 200 people lined up on a public sidewalk, eating for free, precisely because she'd tried to take it away. Thumbnail text: She BANNED MY truck, so I went free.